Good morning. If you're just joining us, we will begin in just a moment. People are still logging in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Continuous Testing, Keeping QA Relevant in the DevOps Journey. During the course of the presentation, if you have any questions, please look for the Q&A button on your interface. Click on that, and you can enter the questions, and we'll address those during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Today's speakers are Terry Brennan and Richard White, and I'm now going to turn it over to Richard.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Terry and I are excited to be able to share with you today. We both joined Orsi a little over 3 years ago to help them move a lot of the services they're offering, which they've always been known as a very QA-focused organization, help them to move that into more of an agile and DevOps, a broader topic. And so what we're going to do is talk to you today about some of the QA components of a DevOps pipeline and some of the new best practices. So you'll see it on the top left-hand slide. We're going to go through just a couple of things to define who we are, maybe 2 slides, and then we'll get really into the meat of the topic. You see there at the top left, DevOps is really the center of everything we do. So our practice specifically focuses on helping organizations really move their practices, the people, and the technology culture aspects into a DevOps view and to streamline that process. But we also have other offerings around app security with our firm called Saltworks, which is the division of Orsi, with integration with tools like ConnectAll that we have that allow you to share information between many of the DevOps tools, and then other services that support that specific DevOps capability. Now, I think in today's world, most people are more familiar with what DevOps is, but just at the bottom of the screen, you'll see, even though you could think of DevOps going all the way back to the visioning and the product road mapping and stuff like that and moving into app dev, we're really going to focus on from the time source code changes are made and as they move through a pipeline, through things like continuous integration, environment availability, having deployments ready, going through the testing, going through monitoring, et cetera, and that occurring at multiple levels. We'll focus on the QA aspect of that today. But from our perspective, when we look at pipelines, we're looking to make them fast, repeatable, and to keep quality there. And what you'll hear us say is, much like going 55 on the highway, most people want their pipelines to be running at 55 miles an hour, but there are certain pieces of that pipeline in most organizations that are running at 3 miles an hour, having detours, just really slowing down. And so what we're going to talk to you today is about how to potentially get back to running 55 and to actually give you some concepts that might actually allow you to go faster. They actually extend the speed limit to 110 because you're able to do things concurrently, et cetera. And I know that sounds impossible. We're going to talk to you about some of those concepts and some of the results we've got working with some of our clients. If you look just at the highest level, what our services are, just 3 major buckets, and then just really high level, we'll put it to you. Strategy is how to really help you look and say, how are we doing things today across the entire pipeline or just on pieces of that, whether it's infrastructure, testing, et cetera, and to really come up with a plan for how you can move forward. Many of our customers bring us in, they feel like they know where they're going, want to go, but that from a delivery perspective, we're able to help them, mentor them, or provide teams to actually help them deploy those capabilities. And then the managed service is really a sort of a unique differentiator for us that allows us to blend in rural and offshore teams, et cetera, to actually provide a lower cost, a managed DevOps solution. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Terry Brennan, who's going to talk through more of the detailed concepts of what is continuous testing in a DevOps world.
Thanks, Richard, and welcome everyone. As Richard mentioned, we're going to walk through what's continuous testing, but we're going to look at that in a few different ways. One, what's driving some of this? So what does industry say? What do we hear? What are some of the QA challenges? And then walk through what is continuous testing, at least how we look at it. I am going to turn my video off because I'm going to be writing on the screen, so I won't distract you from that. But let's go ahead and get started. So overall, what does industry say? So some of you may be familiar with the, if my slide,
technical difficulty.
Use my mouse to hit the button there.
There we go.
All right, well, so the world's changing. And from an overall standpoint, you may have heard of State of DevOps. You know, it's a report that comes out annually from Accelerate. It's interesting in that they're giving a couple guidances. One, they look at different layers. So the elite performers, the high performers, medium performers, low performers, and they gather research about that. And what they found is those elite performers, the top 20% when compared to low performers, are moving many times faster than low performers, but they're actually doing it at a higher quality. And that's what moving towards a continuous footing will sort of give you. So if we look at what they're doing and what they say is, you know, if we think about the frequency at which they deploy, elite organizations compared to lower organizations are deploying over 200 times faster. They're actually able to go from commit to deploy over 100 times faster. When they have a problem, they're able to recover over 2,600 times faster. And in doing all this, even though they're moving so much faster, they're actually able to do it with 7 times lower issues. So they're able to do it with higher quality. So there's a lot of advantages to being able to move more quickly and to be able to move in this continuous direction. And if you're not able to, there is a price for getting left behind, which is sort of what we're going to talk about today is how do we make sure we keep pace? Because if you look at it over here over time, there's been a widening gap between these elite performers and between these low performers. Going forward, if you sort of extrapolate that, right, it's just going to continue to widen. And sometimes you can almost internally, you thought of this as some dev practices, sometimes some of the QA organizations are getting stuck and are more manual, and that gap between them is accelerating, and the QA teams are feeling that pressure because they need to be able to move more quickly and move at that speed. So what do we see? So as Richard mentioned, you know, yes, the world's changing. DevOps is bringing a promise of world-class delivery, of faster, more stable, more secure, more reliable, allowing us to hopefully move in a continuous way, sort of through this pipeline where we're going from dev to QA to UAT into prod. And we're doing that very seamlessly. But it's not something you get to overnight. It's certainly something that's going to be a journey, and there's a lot of twists and turns and challenges in going through that journey. Some organizations that we've worked with, they're maybe not started. They're down on this lower side where they're sort of what we call generation zero. Those organizations may be primarily still manual. They're probably still very siloed. They've got a lot of different components and factors that come into play that they have a hard time managing and controlling. And often there's a very different cultural beliefs between the teams and how they approach it. And one may be pushing change, another one wants to limit or control change. So different cultural practices as well. We also see the groups that are now starting to move forward. They tend to be in sort of that middle performer area. They're still basically doing business as usual. So they're doing a lot of the same things. They're still siloed, but they're actually starting to attack pieces of this. So from a QA standpoint, what we see is that these groups may be still doing a lot of manual tests. They may be, you know, doing UI tests, but they haven't moved towards being able to reduce the manual and really drive out automation. So they're doing some limited QA test automation that helps them move forward, but it's generally still siloed. They're not connecting it, say, to the infrastructure or to the dev teams. There's a second generation that's going. In those groups, they're a little bit higher, sort of those higher end. Those folks are changing the business as usual. So they're changing what they're doing. They're breaking down some of those silos. They're changing those process, applying things like shift left, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about. They're doing things like moving towards continuous testing, whereas in the first generation, we see folks are generally just doing automation, maybe test automation. In this case, they're embracing concepts like continuous testing, which is much more than continuous testing, and they're able to move forward.
By the way, and just a little bit of input, as far as when we talk about the silos, we're really getting into the concept that whether you're the infrastructure team, you're the testing team, whether you're the monitoring group, et cetera, really getting people to really look at that beginning to end and start to think about the end result, as opposed to what we see a lot of people doing is automating those segments because it's such a big challenge. And this allows them to start thinking big picture. And then the other thing is just a business as usual. When he says that, we really mean the steps that we've went through in the past manually. People tend to, when they start automated it exactly the way they did it in the old world. And that's fine to some point, but at some point we really need to rethink the process and what could be as opposed to what's happened in the past.
All right, so we have even fewer organizations that are really moving to a true continuous flow footing. And these may be those elite organizations, the Googles, the Amazons, but it is looking at a very different way of delivering their IT capability and doing things like continuous test and data and sort of pulling all of it into a continuous motion. So what is continuous? We've talked about continuous. You hear it a lot within DevOps and the practices that are coming up. Well, what does it mean? So continuous really comes from lean manufacturing. It's the idea of moving away from batch, where I have these pieces and there's one group here that sort of sits and another group and I sort of queue things and moving forward. I'm more tying those together. So driving towards this idea of continuous flow. So nowadays within the IT and the DevOps side, we've started to embrace some of those ideas. So what does this mean for QA and DevOps? So if we think of how things were before, what would happen a lot of times is we had a change. And unfortunately, the pipelines are not necessarily connected. They're disjointed, disconnected, different organizations. That change hopefully is in the SEM, but it may not be. But ideally it is, at least in the SEM. As that change comes in, now it starts to move through that process. And a lot of times there's a build manager or build master. Somebody's got to go actually take that change, pull those pieces, do the recompiles, build the artifacts. A lot of times that sits in their queue until they have the ability to do it, and they're going to tackle it. But again, it's very manual a lot of times. It's queue-based, and it's disjointed. So that takes resource, time, and money. Well, maybe it moves further down the pipeline, but again, it is disconnected. Maybe we need environments now. We may need to provision them. We may need to refresh them. So we may need to pull in the infrastructure team. Often that goes into a queue. It may sit in that queue. It may wait. And again, that's going to cost resource, time, and money. It then needs to be deployed. Now I got my artifacts in my environments. I need to deploy those artifacts within those environments. Again, that may go into somebody else's queue, and it may be sitting there in that siloed organization, and they may have maybe some scripts, but a lot of times that's manual. And they're sort of waiting, and it's slowly moving through that process, which is, again, resource, time, and money. I may need some database changes, so I've got to get the DBAs, and they're busy. It goes into their queue. Maybe they have to change a schema. Maybe they have to refresh your test data or make some change like that. And again, it's going to sit in that queue and wait, and that's costing resource, time, and money. And then finally, at some point, I'm actually able to test. Now, it may not be, hopefully it's not production, but let's say it's at a lower environment. So I'm finally going to be able to test, but a lot of times our testing is still manual. And again, a lot of times the QA groups have queues that they're waiting. So again, it's sitting there, and it's overall costing a significant amount of resource, time, and money, and it's slowing down the ability to move that through that cycle.
From an actual perspective, we've worked with many clients where we've improved it. One of the more extreme ones was this process Terry just talked about was taking about 8 days. About 15 people were involved in the process to make things happen because there was a lot of chaos going on, a lot of manual pieces, and there was a ton of waste. Obviously, if there's 8 days in this process, that's just a huge amount. So now we'll talk about the change.
So what we're trying to move forward is DevOps, and the idea of continuous flow and the idea of continuous testing starts to take hold, and we make changes around that. What we're doing is driving to something that is a continuous flow. It's smooth. There's not fractures or silos or disjointedness within that pipeline. It's actually connected with organizations that are working together. It's not that it doesn't cost resource, time, and money. There is, always going to be some level of those within the process, but within an investment up front, we're able to automate a lot more of that. And now get a smooth flow through that pipeline that's allowing changes needed from the business to move quickly, smoothly, hopefully consistently through that pipeline.
And so from our standpoint, if you go back to that example I was talking about, we were able to take that from 8 days to less than 3 hours. And so we saw over a 6,000% increase in our time from beginning to end. We were able to eliminate over 90% of the waste, the things that were slowing us down. So we really were able to take them from 55, they were stuck at 3 miles an hour. They were really able to do 55 miles an hour on the expressway. And the number of people went from roughly 15 on any given week to 1, actually just an automated person kicking off the process and it working. And I know this is an extreme example, but if you think about the money, even if you invest up front, the ability to do it multiple times, hundreds of times a week compared to one time every week, it's just a huge, huge increase.
So what does this mean overall for QA? It means that there's a game-changing move to DevOps and continuous flow, which is accelerating the cycles. It's increasing the pace of change. It's setting higher expectations that we do have a more automated, consistent, provisioned, seamless, integrated, smooth, connected pipeline that's allowing us to drive towards continuous flow, including continuous testing. So let's talk about the challenges of QA. So QA is trying to move forward, and we work with many clients helping them to become a part and embedded in the overall continuous processes that are being done. So let's talk about one, as we talked about, there's an exponential acceleration within the life cycle and the expectations of how often you can move things through. And that's often being delivered by or driven by business innovation and agile delivery cycles, which are shortening it maybe to at least a sprint. If not, if people are doing CI, actually doing daily builds or doing it based on change or pull requests, really moving how fast things are moving through that cycle. QA and testing has to keep up. They have to be able to keep pace with that. And that's a challenge as things are backing up in the queue. In addition, testing is a complex component of the life cycle. There are all sorts of integrations, there's shifting priorities. We talked about accelerating life cycles, different skills. There's also a bunch of processes, tools, tests, and data that all have to come together to be able to test successfully. In addition to that, there are a lot of different types of testing. So it's not like you're only got to address one item. There may be security testing that you've got to deal with. There's front-end UI testing that we've got to deal with. There's other things like performance in there that we're dealing with. Hopefully maybe some level of unit. There's a lot of different types of testing that, again, make this complex and a challenge for QA to figure out how do I address all of these and start plugging these into my flow, my continuous testing cycle. And on top of that, often the organizations are still siloed. So you've got dev, you've got ops, QA, they may all be siloed. Even within the QA standpoint, you may have performance and security, which are entirely separated out, different organizations which are doing those testing, which are separate from other testing organizations. And the problem with a lot of this is rather than shifting left, which is where we want to go, it's stuck right. So it's all end of cycle. So it's maybe something that even if you've moved agile, maybe you're doing per sprint, maybe you at least are able to do it per sprint. A lot of times it may be into the cycle at a end of a release. So that release space versus even sprint, but things are moving to needing to be able to do it daily or multiple times a day. So they're often stuck to the right. And that's putting QA in danger of being left behind. As DevOps and more of this continuous flow is starting in the rest of the organization, QA needs to be able to move forward and drive that. And that's where continuous testing comes in, because what they have to be able to do is significantly refactor how they test and are able to move through that. So overall, we want to provide a way for QA not to be left behind, for QA to be able to keep pace and keep moving. And that's where our continuous testing comes in.
I'm going to stop for just 10 seconds. As you go through, guys, if there's anybody that has a question, please remember you can submit questions through the QA link, through the question and answer link. So let me know if there's anything you want us to answer.
All right. So continuous testing. So what is continuous testing? So with DevOps driving the idea of continuous, and I think most people have probably at least heard of or maybe familiar with the common DevOps terms of continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment. All of those are moving or at least working in a continuous context. Testing needs to be understood and thought of in a continuous context as well, which is why we're pushing the idea of doing things like continuous testing. So what's continuous testing and how can it help you? So continuous testing can help you keep pace, right? It can help you plug into that overall equation and that overall life cycle and pipeline and help you move that forward. So when we look at continuous testing, there's really 9 key elements. And it doesn't mean you have to do all of them right up front. You know, a lot of times folks are going to do this and as a journey and do different pieces. But what we've done is said, okay, these are the things you need to consider, and here's the 9. We talked about this idea of shifting left. That's really sort of the process side, and we'll talk about each of these in some detail as we move on. But that process side of shifting and moving these forward in the equation, the idea of driving test automation in areas that you may already have, such as maybe UI, but other areas like API, performance, and security, pipeline integration. So all of this needs to really be thought of in a larger context. The integration is part of an overall pipeline, an overall life cycle. So QA is critical to that, needs to plug in. Ephemeral environments, so the ability to have dynamic environments, again, to address the need to be able to do things quickly and to do it dynamically. And then 3 elements at the bottom and sort of the deeper shade, test data management, continuous monitoring, and service virtualization are what we call trying to build production relevant environments. This is getting it as close to production so I can catch problems and issues and have a realistic test that's done. And implementing these 3 can help you do that. Those are really the technical and process-oriented pieces. There's 2 pieces, changing the culture and aligning the people or organization, which are just as important, if not even more important, because these are usually things that do disrupt the current state and require us to do things a little bit differently. So let's talk about those individually. So the idea of driving a shift left, the idea of moving these items along our journey and moving items earlier in the process. And that could be the ones that we think of more naturally, certainly like unit, even our regression, but there are other pieces. What can we move up from a performance standpoint or other area? But it's really taking those items and moving those and shifting those left, refactoring and readdressing our QA, but our overall development process to integrate these. Maybe it's on a daily build, maybe it's on a change. Every time that I actually push a change to, it does a build, it pulls, it does a set of automated testing that's going to give me at least confidence that my build is not broken. But that's, that shifting left is really addressing the process side, figuring out how to move away from the idea of end of cycle testing and move these elements, in our, where we looked at, you can't see it as much in back behind, but this idea we were going through dev, QA, and different organizations or different pipeline life cycles, moving these testing elements up forward and being able to do that as early as possible. The second item is increasing automation to meet the cycle needs. So as we talked about moving things left, shifting things left, then what that's really doing is putting it in something that may be executing every day or multiple times a day based on changes going in or pull requests. It's really challenging for an organization if you're doing things manual and maybe have some amount of front-end UI tests to be able to keep pace with those cycles. So what we need to do is look and flip that equation, because the cost to do that and the ability to do that is much more minimized. So by flipping that, we look and find ways to drive automation, pulling those into our shift left process, minimizing. We may always have some amount of manual testing, but at least trying to minimize that as much as possible. We're going to have some front-end tests, which we have, but using things that can be run quickly, can be run over and over again, like API test and unit test to broaden out my testing base, to give me the ability to, every time something's checked in or daily, run a fairly full cycle of testing, so I have confidence in my build and my changes that have been applied, is something that's really important to being able to meet the idea of continuous testing.
And I would just jump in and say we were recently working with a client who their DevOps team had sort of gotten out in front. The QA folks had been doing things in a certain way over the past years, and their DevOps process had this huge initiative that came in, but they were really still looking for, so they were integrate doing all the CI and all the infrastructure and those type things. And we were able to come in and work with that team and really have them to really look at the way the tools, the people, the flow, everything works, so that they could tie in and they could get on that DevOps journey bus, as opposed to being the ones that people sort of pointed to and said, you're sort of holding us back from doing the speed limit that we want to do.
So next is integrating our testing into our DevOps pipeline. So when you think of testing and continuous testing, it's not a standalone item, right? It is the idea of moving that into the overall life cycle and then connecting those. It's working with these teams. When we looked about over here at this connecting the life cycle processes, we have to be able to put testing at all the various points in here that it needs to be. And ideally, again, shifting those left as early as possible. So in driving continuous testing, you have to figure out how to drive that into your DevOps pipeline and include that into your overall development process, into your deployment processes, into your, whether it's QA stage, even on into production. When are those testing elements going to fit in? How much can you automate? Because the more you're able to automate, the more you're able to connect it in, the more you move towards that idea of continuous flow and continuous testing. And then in doing that, you've got to figure out what you've got. So tooling, a lot of people get, I would say, sometimes too focused on the tooling aspect, but certainly tooling is important to all of this, both from test automation, but also, the CI, the infrastructure as code standpoint. So you do need to understand what is in your pipeline, what are the elements of your tool chain that you're using, and how are those going to support and connect to your overall process that you're leveraging, so that you can then change that shift left process. You can embed the automation and start to be able to drive that forward, but do it in a way that connects with the rest of your development process. The fourth area is around building ephemeral environments. And with shift left, that's changing the process. With the automation, it almost goes hand in hand with that to be able to get the speed and connecting it into the overall pipeline. Ephemeral environments are one of the areas that it starts to remove constraints. You can do some of this without ephemeral environments, certainly, but the challenge is that's oftentimes static, which means it becomes sequential, which means it becomes a bottleneck. Moving towards the idea of ephemeral environments, you get a lot of advantages. Ephemeral means dynamic, right? I'm going to spin it up, spin it down. So in this case, I'm going to come in, and when maybe I need to execute a certain type of test, part of that overall pipeline is I'm going to provision, ideally a production relevant, but I'm going to provision a set of environments that are going to now be able to take that and execute my test that I need to. Maybe that's regression test, or it could be performance test. But I'm going to be able to execute that across my spectrum, get my result. And as Richard mentioned earlier, we've worked with clients where when they got the result, it was automated to the point of, if it succeeded and passed all the required automated tests for that particular piece, it actually recycled. So it released that environment. So that whole life cycle from beginning to end was automated and creating a new environment each time. If it failed, it kept the environment up and gave you notifications over here. But the big thing was that you could go through that process. It was quick. You had everything that you needed. It was production relevant in that case. And beyond that, you could do that multiple times. So if I'm running my regression test up here in parallel, maybe have some level of performance, some level of security testing, that I'm doing, but I can do those sequentially because I'm creating and provisioning that environment each time, and I'm releasing it. So it's both efficient from a timing standpoint, but it's also efficient from a costing standpoint. It also allows me, rather than be dependent on other people that may be in the environment or moving into the environment, I can have control of my own environment, so I can minimize the variability and have a better confidence that the errors I'm finding out of my testing are based on the testing and not a data issue, an environment issue, or usage conflict with other players within the environment.
So the real game changer here is that you're able to spin up and down environments. So at this point, what we've done is we've automated the old business as usual components so that we can do them repeatably, consistently. Then we've rethought through the process to say, if we're going to do this more than once, we're going to do it continually. What are the things that have to happen to change in the process and the tooling to allow that to happen? And then you have to think about how you're going to be able to orchestrate A, B, C, D, and E within that process. And then all of a sudden, you've now thrown in, I'm able to dynamically create environments and concurrently launch multiple kinds of tests in a pipeline simultaneously, potentially to totally, completely change the length of the overall pipeline beginning to end. So this is a huge component, and I would say, a much more advanced piece.
All right, so the next three are, we talked about earlier, the creating production relevant environments. And this somewhat applies to the ephemeral environments, but we sort of kept that out as just a key building block. But this idea of creating production relevant environments, as we're moving to a continuous testing, we want to have as realistic of outcome for our test so that we don't have to stop, so we're not missing, we can get that flow. A big part of that is managing the data. And with test data management, one, we want it to be production relevant. So ideally we are pulling production data, but most of the time we're going to have to do something like mask it. So if we can get production data and we can mask it, and then we can create it into a virtual component that I can, just like I do my ephemeral environments, when I'm starting up my test, I have my environment, and that environment is one focused on me, purpose fit, but it's also ideally a very similar footprint to production. Same thing with my data. If I'm able to virtually or in a continuous way get my data that's production real, has been masked, now inject that into that ephemeral environment, now I'm doing testing that is on real data, but it's also fast. With this virtualized and the ability to manage the test data like this, that is really contributing to that continuous testing, because again, you're minimizing the time. You're not waiting on the DBA to refresh the data or drive it, drive data into that environment for you. It's already set up. It's already connected, as we talked in the integration before, to that pipeline overall.
And it knows whether it's security scope data versus performance scope data versus unit test base.
Yep. Yeah, and the individual data components, again, could be, this one may be for your performance. You could have one for security. You may have others for regression, but they can all be a version of your production data, so that you're doing realistic size, realistic sort of footprint for that data, and can connect the nuances from that. Another part of the being production relevant is continuous monitoring. And a big part of lean also drives this out. The idea of putting andon lights, the ability to detect a problem, whether that problem could be in my app, which is probably standard, or in my pipeline. I want to be able to detect that problem and then visualize it, because I want to be able to do something about it. And if I move that monitoring back into my lower environments, maybe even my dev, QA, and stage, then again, I've got a production relevant environment. I've got something I can move through quickly, that I have visibility, because we're having lots of data. Sometimes that's a challenge in and of itself with a lot of this tooling and automation. I have lots of data, but what am I going to do with it? So I can start to manage, because I can measure. So, Deming says you can't manage what you can't measure. Well, I may have a lot of the data, but what do I start to do with that? And how do I set it up so that it's continuously telling me when I have a problem as early, again, as part of that shift left in the process as I can. And then finally, for creating production relevant environments and supporting that ability to push testing, shift it left, is service virtualization. So the ability, when you're pushing testing to earlier elements in your life cycle, it may be internal dependencies or it may be third party, but there may be services or dependencies that are not available. What service virtualization can allow you to do is capture those and build process and models that will allow you to mimic those so you can still get, again, a full, relevant, and accurate test, even shifting left and being very early in the process by stubbing out or mimicking, right, those services. So virtualization, you have your data, virtualization of your services, all can help you build that continuous testing flow and allow that to move pretty quickly. So those are sort of the technical and the overall process issues. Two big pieces are changing the culture and aligning the organization we talked about earlier. When you go through these processes, when you're shifting things left, when you're driving a lot more automation and moving away from manual, when you're figuring out how this connects into your overall life cycle and drive that out, that typically is a big change. A lot of times these organizations are siloed. They're not used to working together. It's more of a handoff than this connective tissue. So culturally, it's a big change to drive that out. And that's what we find. Sometimes it's harder than the technical changes because technology is at least somewhat finite and there's only so many ways you can handle it, but there's unlimited combinations of people and organizations and sort of their culture. So when you move to it, it's sort of like a DevOps cultural move, which is very similar, but it's going towards more of a collaborative environment where you're talking and working together, breaking down those silos. It's high trust so that people feel like they can trust each other and rely on each other. It's being able to experiment, fail fast, and not being penalized overly for that. The willingness to embrace change and innovation, the ability to stay transparent, so when there are problems, we're actually empowered to do something about it. But it is a pretty significant cultural shift that you need to take into account. And finally, the last element within the overall continuous testing framework is you have to align the people in the organization. We talked about earlier that these, ops, development, QA, they're often siloed and there's often many other silos in there. You put in security, you may have separate, performance and other areas that need to be executed through. Those organizations need to be aligned because if it's going to be continuous, if it's going to move in a continuous flow, continuous testing standpoint, those groups can't be thrown over the wall. They need to be working together. They need to be finding that common ground and working together to align the people in the process side so that the changes and the needs that the business and the customers have can flow down through that development life cycle, deployment life cycle, and out into production as quickly as possible.
And in many of the organizations we're dealing with, the ones where we've had the biggest impact has been when they're culturally ready to allow us to help them make those changes. We've helped quite a few companies from a tooling and from a process perspective, but culturally, it's been a much slower move of the, we are moving them forward. It's light years better than it was, but you don't see the exact same kind of results because culturally, they're really already built, their silos there for a reason that they believe. And getting them to actually see that through automation and compliance and things like that, that they can actually achieve these things without somebody having to be there to say yes or no is a major hurdle that we have to get over. And we're still fighting, we continue to challenge that in every organization we almost go into.
Yep. So in summary, just wrapping up, so continuous testing is a way for QA to keep pace with the overall changes that are going on at the DevOps and the overall organization level. 9 key elements. One is that shift left, which is the process side of how do I move testing earlier, embed it more in the processes up front. How am I doing my test automation and driving those items out so I can actually support that shift left and actually get continuous flow? How am I integrating that into my life cycle overall, my pipeline, and make that work with the rest of my tooling and capabilities that I have? How do I build ephemeral environments that give me that flexibility and speed that's required to meet a continuous testing type of framework and footprint? The 3 production relevant aspects. How do I get test data that can also be virtualized and managed very quickly so it can be part of that continuous flow? How do I do my service virtualization and continue to drive those elements out as well? And how do I overall pull those things together and make that finite? And then two pieces around the overall cultural and alignment aspects, changing the culture and aligning the organization.
So what I want to do is just really quickly, there's a couple things to cover before we let everybody go for the rest of their evening. We do have a couple of questions. I wanted to at least address one or two of them. One of them came in and says, I understand continuous testing from general concepts, but honestly, we aren't anywhere close to being ready to go there. Where would you recommend starting to get the ball rolling? So I'll sort of let you, let's just take like 60 seconds. I know we won't hit it deep.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there's a lot of different places you can start, but a lot of times when we see groups start down the, if you will, generation one, first generation side, one is, it's fairly obvious, it's testing automation, right? It's how do I start to build some of my testing automation? Maybe in the areas that are not as typical, maybe I have some front end automation that's going on, but it's looking at things like API automation. How can I do things that can be repeatable and quick? So you can start doing that because it's, you know, mainly in your control. Another good area is a lot of times organizations will start getting some of the ephemeral environments, the infrastructure as code, that ability to quickly provision environment and then deploy your app on it so you can then do that testing. That's another area that people will start to tackle because there's a lot of testing is one area, but it's helpful across the board. So I would say test automation is a great place to start, as well as the overall infrastructure as code or ephemeral stacks. And a lot of clients will start with, hey, can you help us sit down and do a strategy and roadmap it out so that you can actually help me identify what are the key areas I can move forward with in my environment, because there's no single answer.
And we do have a couple other questions. What I'm going to do is, if you could just jump forward to the sort of what we, you know, sort of our call to action, and then if we have time, I'll answer these. If we don't, I do have who sent the question, so we will follow up. So the real quick thing I want to make sure we get out is our offer to you is we have some people that are incredibly deep in this space, DevOps and in the testing and refactoring of QA. You know, what we're willing to do is anybody who reaches out to us, we'll set up a 1 hour where we'll take one of these topics, one of the things that you think is one of the biggest challenges for you, and we'll basically talk to you in detail about what we've seen some of our clients do to achieve this, how we've helped them, and how that aligns with where they are and what some of the steps need to take. You know, probably can't go through all of these steps. Most people are only ready for a piece of this. Very few folks have this all built out. So if you're interested, please let us know. We'll happily address that. So we do have a couple of minutes. Let me just take a look at my clock here. I know we're right up against it. You have the 3 minutes. So one of the other questions we had, and I'm going to bring up, well, we've got a bunch of questions coming in. Let's see here. If one of our challenges is that whenever there's a change in the process is to explain and convince the product owners or managers or business analysts. How do I explain them in the shift left approach to them in layman's terms? That question, I want to make sure that one of the challenges we have is whenever there's a change in the process is to explain and convince product owners or the business analysts. How do I explain them the shift left approach to them in layman's terms? Anything that you would?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say one of the things we see that a lot because a lot of the organizations are, I guess I can look at a lot of the organizations are still siloed and they're not connected. And that's where part of that shift left, ideally, maybe you can engage them and bring them a little more into your process. I think overall people are starting to get a context from a DevOps, which is driving that need to connect. So ideally, you can leverage a little bit about, okay, that we're driving this in support of a DevOps and to make this faster and more aligned. Part of that is working with them, right, and helping fit it in earlier in their process. So I think walking them through and talking in terms that are going to have impact and business value for them, sort of more directly in their space, and then able to walk them through and see where the benefits and how much more quickly they can get feedback especially if, if you're talking to a product manager, they may be doing A/B testing or want to do those type of things. Well, being able to move that type of testing, be able to move some of these conditions earlier or capabilities earlier can help that. So there's direct benefit they can have, and I think it's just talking them through what you can put in place enables some of that for them.
And I do see quite a few other questions. I do promise you that Ben and I think it's Manavanan and several others that are anonymous, we will follow up and try to get answers to each of the questions. I think we're right up against the time. We really appreciate you guys joining us. We really think that we have some we've seen some amazing tangible business results coming out of some of the concepts that we've talked about, and we would love to talk to you guys one-on-one and see how we could help you going forward. We look forward. I'll throw it back to you, Chris, if you want to wrap up.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, and thank you everyone for attending. Again, we do have a record of any questions asked that we were not able to get to, and Terry and Richard will get with you offline to address those questions. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.